G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Gonna make a video about the power grid, about the alleged so-called gold-plated poles and wires, which is apparently causing all the elevated electricity prices around Australia, in the view of some self-serving populist politicians, at least. That's the story, gold-plated poles and wires. Their theory is that ever since the power grid was privatised, the executives and directors of the various companies that purchased the power distribution grids and the generating plants from the various state governments that used to own them, these people have been viciously and malevolently constructing grid extensions to places that didn't need them. And that's why they've been building so many more poles and wires, and that's why the cost of electricity is as high as it is, because you have to pay for all the poles and the wires and the grid extensions, which have allegedly been needlessly built. Well, strangely, that wasn't the observed experience. My experience has been that this particular 132,000 volt power line was put in place in about 1960-61. I think it was switched on in 62 or 63. So these two wooden posts, the actual pole in the tower, and this other one they call the lightning riser, they've spent 55 to 57 years out in the wind and the rain and the snow and the sun and the heat. And it's the same with those towers and lightning risers. Well, they've all been there for about 55 years. The only preventative maintenance which has been done here would be cutting and trimming the trees on the edge of the power line easement. I've seen some of that going on. Back in 2015, double parallel lift capacity, I heard some funny noises up here at the far end of the block, and I found there was a crew up here with two great big cranes and a cherry picker. Two of the cranes on one base. I don't know, 8 or a dozen blokes. And essentially what they were doing was using one crane to pick up the tension on that lightning conductor, and then while they had the lightning conductor being held up by the crane, they would then use the other crane running in parallel to lift out the wooden lightning riser and replace the old splintering wooden lightning riser with a shiny new metal one, like this one, as you can see. Much more durable. Now that is what's called preventative maintenance. And sad to say, in order to maximise the profits to the shareholders of the companies which have purchased the power distribution grid, there's been progressively less and less and less preventative maintenance performed for about the past 20 years, maybe 35 years. 3 years ago, as they were proceeding northwards with their actual, literal, preventative maintenance program, they got as far as my place. They didn't get over my boundary. And they managed to change one of the lightning risers on my place, but they never got over here where we have wooden risers 55 years old, both sides of the tower. That's to the north of me. Here on the tower on my place, the bit that I pay rates on, we have one of each. Or more precisely, I have two steel lightning risers, but one of them is not yet fitted because 3 years ago, small world theory, when they were doing all this stuff, the red-headed linesman nearest to the camera is a bloke I haven't seen for 40 years. We were in tech drawing classes together at Glen Innes High School. See that big cloud in the background there? In 1975. Well, what happened was after they got one lightning riser replaced, that cloud in the background, it grew into being a thundering storm. And the thundering storm made some lightning on the horizon, and these fellas playing with the lightning conductor, while there was 132,000 volts of electricity going through the main three conductors, they decided that this was a mug's game. So they packed up and they buggered off and they went home. And they said they would be back shortly, directly, in due course, when they got around to it. And in the meantime, would it be all right with me if they left this galvanised steel lightning riser to be overgrown by the native vegetation where they left it, in the power line easement at the foot of the tower, that one of these days, when they get a chance, they might perhaps, possibly, maybe find their way clear to coming out here and replacing that old one with the new one. That's the theory. But what's going on is there's this thing called anthropogenic global warming. And under the terms and conditions of anthropogenic global warming, everything becomes more extreme. The winds become windier, the droughts become droughier, the floods become floodier. The storms become stormier and the hail becomes hailier. And in the 3 years since they completely failed to replace that wooden lightning riser and to install their brand new replacement rinky-dink, wouldn't it be lovely if it was actually up the pole and doing its job type of a unit, I think what's been going on is that there's been so many storms and there's been so much wild weather, which has been doing so much damage to the infrastructure of the power distribution grid, that they haven't actually had time to come out of emergency repair mode and even think about getting back into preventative maintenance mode. Preventative maintenance, that's what you do when you can afford to fix the system before it breaks. And since it was privatised, the shareholders are not actually interested in that because they're planning on probably selling their shares on the short term before it breaks. They want a dividend now. And of course, we're not going to get any favours out of anthropogenic global warming, are we? We pushed through 410 parts per million about a month ago. At the moment, we're in winter, the second day of winter, and I haven't actually seen 0 degrees in the forest yet. I've seen 0 degrees in the clearing, but not in the forest. We used to generally have the last perfect warm day of autumn was Anzac Day, 25th of April, the day Australia celebrates the memory of when Australia and New Zealand invaded Turkey. for the glory and honour of the British Imperial realm. And during the last month, during autumn, up here in a eucalyptus forest, I measured 4.1 millimetres of dew, and I only measured 1.8 millimetres of rain. So this whole forest is drying out. It's desiccating. The trees are starting to prepare to drop their leaves in an attempt to put some sunshade onto their roots and prevent their roots from drying out so the tree can try and stay alive through the dry spell. But if this is what it's like on the second day of winter, then what's it going to be like in 3 months' time when we're going into spring? If the country is this dry now. See the brown patches in the trees where they're to dump their leaves because they can't afford the amount of water that all those leaves are transpiring. So when the forest is completely, totally dried out at the end of winter, when the winds of August arrive, how are these 50-something-year-old wooden lightning risers going to cope? And how's the forest going to cope if sparks from a lightning conductor dropping down onto a power conductor following a failure of the lightning riser should happen to set alight to the dryness of the forest? Isn't that an interesting question? So, next time you hear the story of the gold-plated poles and wires being floated as an excuse for why your electricity bill is so terribly high, then you just think about how piss poor a job they've done on gold plating these poles and wires, if that story was true. Doesn't look to me as if they spent any great deal of money on gold plating this part of their poles and wires. I don't think they've done sufficient in the way of preventative maintenance. I think they're running on emergency repairs, and I think that as the increasing stress of the weather on the ageing infrastructure makes itself felt, I think there's going to be more and more and more blackouts, and they're going to last for longer and longer, and there's going to be more and more and more bushfires sparked off by failing electrical infrastructure. But I might be wrong, I suppose, maybe, perhaps, it's possible. Sometimes I have been known to get shit wrong. Anyway, that's my little rave on the gold-plated poles and wires, which aren't so gold-plated after all, and my tips on the future of the power grid as global warming makes itself increasingly felt. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.